Hello and welcome to part 2 of the R1300 series. Now if you've been following the channel you would have seen this video down here, which was my initial impression of the R1300 about 4 months ago when the bike first came out, and that was a base version which had quite a lot of optional extras fitted, but there was one particular one which was the adaptive ride height control, which it didn't have. So it has took me quite some time to get BMW to give me a different bike with the specification that I really wanted for this review, and they've done a great job. It has took them some time, but this is a triple black version and it's got most of the options that I would pick, not all of them, and that's going to help me explain to you some things as we move through this series. So today's going to be focused at two different types of viewer. There are going to be those of you that already have the 1300, and if you've got dynamic ESA and 7 ride modes, in other words ride mode Pro, there is an option within the menu system called DSA, Dynamic Suspension Adjustment. And over the last 4 months I've met up with about 12 owners that have these new R1300s. And I would say, in all honesty, over half of them hadn't got a clue what DSA is, let alone the fact that it was installed on their bike and was an option, but importantly, how they can use DSA within the menu system to improve the handling and performance of the suspension on their motorbikes. So that's what we're going to cover partly today, is those of you that already have the R1300 with DSA, how to access those suspension changes and what effect do those changes make. And then importantly, I'm also going to talk about specifications, speccing up your bike correctly in the first place. So this part of the video will be aimed at those of you that are still thinking about a 1300 and haven't yet placed your order, because ticking the right boxes when you order your bike is going to be really important, because it is possible to end up with a new R1300 that in terms of suspension adjustment is inferior to the outgoing 1250, and that seems really quite ridiculous. So you have to be really careful with the options that you tick so that you end up with a bike that has more capability than the outgoing 1250. So I will do a bit of a side-by-side and explain those differences as we move forward. Anyway, let's get started with DSA. So for those of you that already took delivery of your new R1300, and those of you who are expecting delivery, let me explain a little bit more about DSA. But first, before we do that, I think it's probably worth your while understanding the ride modes and the 3 main suspension modes before we get into these damper settings with compression and rebound. So along the middle here, there are 7 ride modes: Eco, Rain, Road, Dynamic, Dynamic Pro, Enduro and Enduro Pro. There are 7 modes. So you can ride your motorbike in any of those 7 modes. But within each of those modes, it's important to understand that there are lots of electrical systems on the motorbike and lots of different sensors. And the engineers have predetermined what the limits are and what's going to happen in each of those main riding modes. And they make small but significant changes to things like ABS intervention, traction control, wheelie control, also suspension. There are a lot of things that change as you go through each of these different ride modes. And it's up to you to have a play and see which one of those main ride modes you like to ride in. And they also change things like throttle input, fuel maps, power delivery, and it all changes as you go through those 7 modes. Now, underneath those 7 main ride modes, there are 3 primary suspension modes. There is road, there is dynamic, and there is enduro. Now, within those 7 modes that you can choose to ride in, as long as you haven't played with your bike and everything's as it is as it left the factory, there are some presets that come from BMW. So for example, in those ride modes, so if we take those first 5, which are the modes you would use riding on the road, and the N2, the Enduro and the Enduro Pro for off-road riding, if we take those first 5, BMW have predetermined that of those 3 suspension modes, the first 3, which is Eco, Rain and Road, will use the road suspension profile. And the way to think of that is it's the comfort mode. That's the way to think of it. And I think BMW could do a better job with naming those three suspension modes slightly differently, and they probably should be called comfort, sport and off-road, because then it makes the whole understanding of this whole hierarchy much easier. But anyway, we'll work with what we got. So we got Eco, Rain and Road, and in those three first ride modes, the automatic pre-selected suspension mode is something called Road. Then as you move along into Dynamic and Dynamic Pro, the system changes automatically to the suspension mode called Dynamic, which is completely different to the Road mode. And then when you move into the two Enduro ride modes, Enduro and Enduro Pro, the system then changes a third time into the Enduro suspension mode. Now, in addition to that, there is one level deeper than that, which is to go into each of those three primary suspension modes, and you can adjust compression and rebound. Now, if you don't know what they are, don't worry about it too much. I have got a video explaining more about that. But in essence, in oversimplified terms, you can soften up the suspension or you can firm up the suspension. So, for example, looking at those ride modes, those 7 ride modes, you can mix and match the type of suspension setting you have that will automatically be used with the ride modes. So for example, as standard, Eco, Rain and Road use the Road mode suspension setting, but you can, if you want to, change that automatic setting. Instead of using the Road mode, it will use the dynamic suspension adjustment. Now you might be thinking, why would you need to do that? Well, sometimes, especially with this new 1300, there's a huge difference in terms of throttle control and power delivery when you switch to the dynamic modes. But you might be out having a nice gentle ride, the roads are beautifully smooth, and you see a series of lovely bends that you want to enjoy, but you actually like the feel and the control of the throttle in the Road mode, in that Road mode selection. But you would like to add the dynamic suspension to that mode, and you can do that. And you can also do the opposite. So when you move out of those first 3 modes into Dynamic and Dynamic Pro, the automatic pre-selected suspension profile is dynamic, but you can of course change that to Road mode. So why would you do that? Well, you might be a more experienced rider that really likes that instant throttle response. You want that front wheel to come up a little bit, and you don't mind the back of the bike coming up under hard braking, and you just generally prefer the feel in terms of performance of how the bike performs in Dynamic and Dynamic Pro. But maybe the roads that you're riding on are pretty awful, and you want a softer, more compliant suspension setting, in which case you can change it from dynamic to the softer, more comfortable setting of Road. And it is a brilliant system. So what you can then further do, and I'll move the camera around so you can have a look, we can go into those 3 main suspension settings, Road, Dynamic and Enduro, and we can change the way that suspension profile functions in terms of making it softer or firmer. So one of the things you can do, for example, some people find that in ride mode, Road, in suspension mode, Road, the bike is not quite as compliant and as comfortable as the old 1250. But what you can do, you can now go into the settings and you can soften off that Road mode suspension setting, in effect making it really very, very plush and very, very comfortable. And especially if the road surfaces are really bad, there's lots of potholes and lots of undulations, you can in fact change that compression and re-down setting within each of those 3 modes. So I think I'll turn the camera around and show you the menu system. Now what we want to do is find the place where we make our compression and rebound adjustment, and this is a lot of fun on the road. So we're going to use the traditional menu button. We're going to press down once, And then we can move along from our vehicle settings. We can select the sport screen, and we go all the way along until we get to the settings option. We go down one level, and it's a very strange name, but what we're looking for is this word here that says assist. We move to the right once, and it's asking us which system do we want to access. And what we want to access is suspension, so we go right one more time. It then asks us, are we really sure we want to go in here? Yes, we do. We want to go into damping configuration. We go right one more time, and this is where the fun really starts. These are the three primary modes that we can adjust: road, dynamic, and enduro. So if we go right, now currently you can see there's 0 selected. So this is the standard pre-selection that BMW have decided is the most likely and most used setting for each of these three ride modes. So we're going to go into road, and now using the whiz wheel, we can go +1, +2, in other words, making the damping more firmer. Or if we want a really soft, squidgy, super comfortable ride on the motorway, we can still, within the road mode, go to -2, which will really, and it does make a significant difference, soften off the suspension. So what I found was in road mode, I set it to -1, and I click once to the right to say OK, and what it does, it remembers these settings. So now in road mode, I've got the damping setting to -1, so it's a little bit softer than the standard setup. Then we can scroll down and go into the dynamic mode. Move once to the right. It's currently set to 0, same as the other options, +2, +1, standard, -1, -2. Now I actually find that the standard setting of 0 is really very, very good. I did have a bit of a play on having it on its maximum setting, but in the rain, on soaking wet roads, it really wasn't a lot of fun. But I did find that moving it back to +1 actually just firms the already quite firm dynamic suspension mode up just that little bit more. And I reckon in the sunshine on the dry roads, this is gonna be a lot of fun. Now, for those of you that do go off-road, in enduro mode, we've got those same options. So we move right, and of course, we can then go to +1, +2. In other words, making the enduro mode firmer. Or we can go the other way and we can soften things off completely, and we can have -2 in terms of compression and rebound in the enduro mode. Anyway, I just thought I'd show you that because it's not something that a lot of people have talked about on the press launch, and I think this is a really big feature that people should be talking about, because if you do have dynamic ESA and you do have all 7 ride modes, then this feature really is a great benefit. So now you have a better understanding of what the 7 ride modes are, how to make adjustments, and what are the 3 primary suspension modes on the R1300GS. And in particular, we now have additional adjustment in terms of compression and rebound, basically, or simply explained as firming up or softening up each of those 3 ride modes. So with the new GS, we also have something called EVO Telelever and EVO Paralever suspension. And you're probably aware that there's been quite a bit of talk about this adjustable spring rate, which you have on the new 1300, and it is simply brilliant. And in very, very simple terms, on the old 1250, if you were a big heavy rider and you carried lots of gear and a passenger, the best way to get the most from this motorbike is to go to a suspension specialist and have a pair of springs, rear and front, matched to your weight. And if you do that, the bike does transform. It really is quite a noticeable change. So that's one thing that you would have to do on the old 1250. But on the new R1300, you don't really need to do that unless you're incredibly heavy and you carry a huge amount of gear, because the new system adjusts the spring rate by an additional 20%. So let me explain. So first off, this adaptive ride height control. So we've talked about eco, rain and road. In those 3 modes, the adaptive vehicle height control system turns into something called auto. Once you've driven away and the bike rises up, it then goes into the automatic mode. But in terms of variable spring rate, in those first 3 modes, it is in the standard mode. And what does that mean? Well, that means that the bike rides on the standard springs that are fitted to the front and the rear, those great big tall springs that we can see, and they're normally white in colour, and that's how the bike rides. It rides on those springs. Now then, when you move through those ride modes and you then go into Dynamic and Dynamic Pro, adaptive vehicle height control stays in what is called the auto setting. But what it does do, it changes automatically to the additional spring rate. In effect, adding 20% spring rate rating via a valve, which opens a circuit, which then is bringing to activation 2 additional springs, front and rear. And it is really noticeable. And in very, very simple terms, it's like taking your adventure touring bike and a flick of a switch, you turn it into more of a sports bike. And I love it. It's simply brilliant. But another feature that isn't really talked about is when you then move to the last 2 modes, which are Enduro and Enduro Pro, the adaptive vehicle height control system then changes. And it changes from auto mode to low mode, so that you can get your feet much more easily on the ground, and then those springs, because that preload is wound off, you have the full travel of those springs. But in addition, the adaptive spring rate control, instead of either being standard or the firm, which is the plus 20%, the system automatically changes between those 2 modes. Now, I have tried to get more detail from BMW about exactly when. If I was to take the, I'm not an experienced off-road rider, so I probably couldn't tell the difference. To explain to me how and at what point riding off-road, how hard do I have to ride, and under what conditions does that spring rate change? They don't really want to tell me that, and I understand completely, because all the other manufacturers are going to be looking at what this bike does in terms of that variable spring rate, because it's simply brilliant. And at some point, people like Ducati and Triumph are going to have to follow suit to give us bikes that are as capable in terms of suspension as the new R1300. So I understand why. But there is, in fact, a lot more than that going on in the background, and BMW want to keep that to themselves. So just to be 100% clear, the option of having the adaptive vehicle height control on a new 1300 is definitely something I would do, because of the benefits we've just discussed in the suspension section. But there are a couple of additional benefits, one of which you're probably already aware of, and I'm going to demonstrate, and that's why the camera's down low on the ground. So the first one is the electronic assistance of getting the bike on the center stand, and this really shouldn't be underrated. So all I'm going to do, I'm going to lift the bike off of the side stand. I'm going to turn the ignition on. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to be quiet, but in a moment I'm going to start to press on the center stand lever. Have a look at the bottom of the bike down there and have a listen. Now, I haven't got the bike on the center stand at the moment, so the rear of the bike has gone up, the front of the bike has gone up, and then all I need to do is that last little push to get the bike on the center stand. And it is so much easier than the outgoing 1250. Now, there are a couple of additional benefits with the 1300. The first one is the turning circle. Now, my garage is quite small, but I'm quite often in here making videos. And my 1250 normally sits nose first in that right hand corner, and I have to do a 5-point turn to get my bike out to go up the road. Not on the 1300. I can very easily do it in just a 3-point turn. I can start nose in over there, the back over here, and straight out the door. It is really, really noticeable how much of an improved turning circle this bike's got. So if you're moving it around in tight spaces, there is a big benefit. Now, there is one more which isn't really talked about on the internet by anyone really, and I don't quite understand why. And that is, with the adaptive vehicle height control, when the ignition is turned off, your bike is sitting 30 millimeters lower at the front and 30 millimeters lower on the rear. And that center of gravity is considerably closer to the floor. Now, I found that moving this around the garage, there is a considerable, noticeable difference in being able to pick it up and move it compared to the 1250. It really is quite a significant change. Now, the previous bike I had was that white one, which I remember from about 4 months ago, and that didn't have this system on it. And I found in terms of weight, both bikes fairly similar, moving them around this workshop. So the weight hasn't changed. All that's changed is with that adaptive vehicle height control option ticked, your bike sits 30 millimeters closer to the ground, front and rear, which gets that center of gravity nice and low to the floor, and it is really noticeable. And this is actually quite an easy bike to move around. Anyway, let's move on. So another option I'd like to bring to your attention is the option of forged wheels on the R1300GS. Now, on the outgoing models, we only had two options, aluminium wheels and spoked wheels. And you see the spoked wheels on both of these bikes. But on the new 1300, there is the option called a forged wheel. Now, before I explain the benefits of weight reduction for unsprung mass, which is what the forged wheels bring us, if you were to put the top 10 motorcycling journalists from around the world, from the United Kingdom, from America, from Canada, from Australia, you put them in one room, you gave them an unlimited budget, but they could only choose one performance upgrade for their motorbike, you'd probably find that 8 out of 10 of them would choose lightweight carbon wheels. Now, we can't fit carbon wheels to our off-road bikes. They're not strong enough to cope with those demands. But there are other materials that manufacturers can use. Now, BMW have been developing and testing this forged wheel for quite some time during the development of the 1300. And they're confident that that wheel is going to be performance-wise completely fine off-road. So for me, the benefit is quite substantial. So when we reduce the weight of unsprung mass, that's the weight that is not supported by the suspension, there are lots of benefits. The bike will accelerate and respond to throttle input much quicker. Also, when it comes to slowing the bike down and using the brakes, that rotational mass, because of the reduction in weight, has a huge effect on braking performance. So we've gained performance in acceleration and we've gained performance with brakes. But there's one more significant benefit to going to a lighter wheel setup, and that is handling dynamics. And that is when, for example, the bike's vertical and we're turning into a corner to the right or to the left, the ability to transition from left to right is greatly enhanced with a lightweight wheel setup because there's less rotational mass and the bike will respond much quicker. And that is why, if you look at all the top brands that have hyper performance bikes, they nearly all come with carbon wheels, or there's a carbon wheel option, because the performance benefits are really quite significant with a lightweight wheel setup. So I'm delighted that BMW have thought about that and they've given us a forged wheel option. So these wheels are, I think, just under 2 kilos, 1.8 kilos lighter than the standard wheels. And there is one other benefit, and for those of us with the spoke wheels on the R1250, they're a right pain to clean. They really do take some time. Once you've got your bike filthy and you've been out in the mud, they're really quite tricky to get clean. You can use a pressure washer if you want, but they do take some time to clean. But with the aluminium wheels that were available on the 1250, bucket of soapy water, 5 minutes, they look like new. And that's exactly the same with these new forged wheels that you can get on the 1300. So maintenance is zero, as opposed to the spoke wheels that do need regular checking of those spokes. We've got no maintenance with the forged wheels. They're simple and easy to keep clean. They provide a significant weight advantage. And of course, we've got all those other advantages with in terms of acceleration, braking, and handling dynamics. So for me, although they are quite expensive, I definitely fit them to my bike. Okay, let's move on. So one more option I would definitely tick, and that is this electric screen. For those of us that have been struggling with buffeting and wind noise on the 1250, this is simply a revelation. It's simple and easy to use. We've got electric adjustment, so when we move into towns and cities, it's a really hot day, we just lower the screen down, we get a nice bit of wind movement over us and our helmet and our visor, and we can get cool very quickly. But then when we move through the towns or the cities, and the speed picks up, we can use that rocker switch to take the screen up, and it doesn't create any noise or buffering, and I really like it. I mean, I had this on the first bike that I had for 3 days back in November. The weather was awful, it rained pretty much for the 3 days, it was winter, and I really appreciated the protection that the screen offered. And now I've had this one for 2 weeks and we're starting to move into nicer, warmer weather. I still love it. It simply is an option that I wouldn't be without on the new 1300. So this next topic isn't going to be for everybody, but for me, the performance brakes on the R1300 are definitely worth the extra money. Now, those of you that know me and the channel and have followed me along through my journey, you know I'm a mechanic, a technician. So what I did to give these two bikes a fair comparison in terms of braking, I changed my brake fluid, I took my pads out, I cleaned my pads, the discs, and I also lubricated the pistons inside those calipers to make sure that everything was 100% on my bike. And I noticed quite a little step in performance, which is normal with a brake service. Now, compared to this bike, there's still a huge difference. This is simply fantastic. There are some people that have reported that the performance brake on the R1300 could in fact be better, but I'd actually disagree, because what the enhancements that this bike brings with this brake setup, you can brake so much later and deeper into a turn. If you were to improve the brakes even more, you'd soon end up with a bike that is over braked. And bearing in mind, we can't get around the laws of physics. When this is fully kitted, it's 260 kilos. We still then got to lean the bike over into the corner, no matter how fast we enter into that corner. So I think what BMW have done with this caliper, which is in fact a Brembo caliper, they've got the perfect balance, an improvement over the 1250, but not too much braking, and I really like them. You can brake hard time after time after time. The brakes don't seem to fade, and you can brake that bit later and deeper than you can on the 1250. And it is, for me, a noticeable improvement, and I definitely opt for this. So now you have a much better understanding of what DSA actually is, how to access it within the menu system, and how you can very, very easily, with a little bit of time and a little bit of adjustment, get your R1300 set up in terms of suspension to give you the best possible experience. And it really does make quite some adjustment, as we've seen, and I really like the system. And also, hopefully, for those of you that are still thinking about the R1300, you're still not sure, some of those suggestions I've made with regards to the options will help you get the right bike in the right specification for the type of riding and the type of rider you are, and then moving forward in time, that will protect the value of your motorbike when you come to part exchange it or to sell it. So if you have enjoyed today and you've got something from it, please think about clicking that like button on the video. What that does, that tells YouTube that you've enjoyed it. YouTube then registers that, and then they will recommend this video to other like-minded riders, so they also can get the benefit from these videos. And if you do like the content that I create, think about subscribing. I think this morning when I looked, we were 18,100 subscribers, which for me still is very, very a strange feeling, because there are a lot of subscribers, and I am having a lot of fun putting these videos together. As always, thank you for your time today, and I'll see you very soon for part 3 of the R1300 series. Bye-bye.